relating to the life and work of early career researchers working in the humanities. I'm Charlie, and today I'm joined by Rachel. Hello, Rachel. How are you? What have you been up to?
Hi, Charlie. I'm good, thanks.
Oh,
I have actually been writing on my monograph, so this episode is very
wow,
timely for me.
great. And questions, hopefully, relating to that process that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I'm probably going to grill both you and Laura.
Great. Well, that brings us nicely. Today we have our very special guest, whose name is Laura. Hi, Laura. Say hello to everyone.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, hello. We'll explain who Laura is and why we've invited her on in just a moment. Because today our topic is a tricky one that some of us have been through, and some of us, like Rachel, are about to begin working on and are working on at the moment. So, our topic on episode 9 is how to write your first monograph. We all know there are many ways to publish your work in journal articles, book chapters, and other formats, but in the humanities, some people still regard the academic monograph as something of a gold standard. So we thought maybe we'd talk about how to write a monograph and why you might bother investing years of your life in this process. Some of us who are in the middle of it sometimes want to ask those questions. Um, why do we think monographs are so important? Can I throw that out there? Let's start off. Um, Rachel, why do you think people still bother writing monographs? Do you have any ideas?
Um, it's an excellent form to really do a deep dive in either to a very ambitious topic that you can't cover in a short form publication like an
Mm,
article.
yeah.
So it allows you to kind of interrogate the field as well as your topic a bit more.
Mm,
So that might be one reason.
yeah. You got any ideas, Laura?
No, I think that's right. But there's also the element of tradition and that sense that this is a rite of passage that marks you as somebody with expertise in the field.
Mm,
And now monographs take a really wide range of forms, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. But that idea of this as a sort of qualification almost
yeah.
stage in an academic career is
Yeah.
very persistent.
Yeah, I thought that. Like, you may have written a PhD and passed that, but then, like, what's the next hurdle you have to go through? And maybe it is writing a monograph, but we'll talk about those things again in more detail. So, today we're going to discuss how the process of writing books actually works, with some reflections for us on how we've experienced the various issues that can come up. As ever, you can leave reviews or comments on our Spotify feed. You can follow us on Twitter or X at ECR Podcasters. And now you can follow us on Blue Sky, where our name is also ECR Podcasters. You can also email ecrpodcasters@gmail.com. And we'd love it if you have ideas for topics you'd like us to talk about in future episodes. So the first thing we're going to do is say hello to Laura. Laura, hi. I sort of said I would introduce you and explain why you've joined us for today. So, Laura, could you explain to us what your job role is, what you do, and why perhaps we might have thought you're useful for discussing books?
So I'm a mid-career researcher,
Mm,
moving towards the more experienced end of that. And I'm currently coming towards the end of a big research project. But before that, I did a decade in just general university teaching. So I've got a fairly wide range of experience. And I suspect that you picked me because I've done quite a lot of publishing in different formats. So I've written two monographs, I've collaborated on two co-authored books, and then I've done a fair amount of editing. So I've seen a lot of other people's work, both
mm.
in terms of collections of essays and monographs. And I'm a series editor, so I get to see a fairly wide range of book proposals coming in from both early career and more experienced people.
And the kind of personal connection element there is that you've seen a lot of my work as
I
well
have seen a lot of your
as
work,
an
yeah.
editor. So yeah, my apologies in public for any of that. So we thought we'd start by talking about the publication process and how it works. So
Mm.
great to have you along, Laura. Thank you for joining us. Rachel, feel free to jump in with questions if we've got. But I thought it would be useful to our very early career researcher listeners who might just have no idea about how you go about publishing a book. And even if you do have an idea, to maybe reiterate those stages of how you begin, even the process of before you've even written the book, like what sorts of things do you have to do? So, Laura, we wondered if you might take us through those stages.
Okay. I think the first thing to do if you've just finished a PhD or a major piece of research is to ask yourself whether this is a book. Not all PhDs are books, and I think we'll maybe come back to that later. But have you got something to say that is going to be best served by a monograph format? And then is that a long monograph, a short monograph? What kind of book is it? And if you're determined that actually you want to put the blood, sweat, and tears that are going to be required into writing a book, who is going to publish it? So choosing a press is important. We can come back to this in more detail, but you need to look around and think, okay, now that I know what kind of book it is I want to write, who publishes those kinds of books? There's no point sending your proposal to somebody that publishes nothing else like it, nothing in your field or nothing in that kind of format. Find publishers that have done similar kinds of projects and get in touch with them. Very often in that process, other people that you know, your supervisor, your friends will be able to help you and give you contacts and maybe set up an informal chat before you go any further, and just make sure that you're not wasting your time or anybody else's time by pursuing that. And then once you think you've found a press, have a look at what they want for a book proposal. Most of this will be online somewhere, but what do you need to send? All presses have slightly different expectations. So again, make sure that you are matching what you submit to what they require. Typically, they will want to know what your book's about, some kind of short abstract and overview. They will want an outline of the contents. And this, I'm sure we'll come back to this in more detail, but this requires a bit of thinking about, for somebody who has not seen your project before and is coming to it cold, what do they need to know about your book? It usually involves a statement about who you think the intended audience is. Are you writing for undergraduates, other academics, a wider audience? Your PhD probably was read by you, your supervisors, and some examiners, and that is its audience. But a book needs a wider audience. So who are you aiming at now? They'll want to see a sample chapter. So the next thing to do is to produce something that you're happy to show to a wider audience. And you need to think a bit carefully about what will give the best impression of this book from a sample. And then when you've got all of those materials together, you send that off and you wait. And I'm
You
sure
wait. I was going to say you wait.
You wait. This, for humanities in particular, this is usually a slow process. What will then happen is that the editors at the press will look at your materials. They'll decide whether they're interested in it or not. If they're not interested, you might get a very quick response that just says, this is not for us. And that's not something you should take personally necessarily. There are lots of reasons why your book might not be right for that press or right for that press at that moment. And this is where you can speed the process up a little bit by making sure that you've done your homework before you start and are looking at a press that publishes things a bit like yours. If they like it, they'll usually send it to a reader or more than one reader, and eventually you will get some feedback. As you know, things are really tough at the moment. Everybody is overworked, and there's a lot of chat about the difficulty of finding people to review things, the length of time that it's taking.
Yeah.
all of this is having a knock-on impact, and it's particularly bad for early career people. But you'll then get some feedback, and they will talk you through the next stages, what it is that they want you to do. You may need to submit more materials. They may say the next thing we want to see is a full manuscript. And at that point, or somewhere along that line, they will give you a contract. You will write a book. It will then go through review again. You will get edits and proofs, and eventually you will be the proud possessor of a beautiful finished book that will be available
Yay.
in all good specialist bookshops and on the internet.
I wanted to grab mine and hold it up, but it's on another shelf
So
somewhere
proud
up
of it.
there. Yeah.
That there are so many components to what you've described, Laura, and so many moving parts that are dependent not only on the author of the monograph, but also a whole community of scholars that essentially help produce manuscripts, right? Or monographs rather, that actually it's not just one person. There's a number of people that come together. And it really struck me that there are so many threads to producing a monograph. So how long, in your experiences, both you and Charlie, how long should someone factor into actually from
Do you
the
know,
beginning to the production of
someone
the
asked me that literally yesterday, how long does it take? Like, how long should I take? If I'm going to write a book, what's the time scale?
Mm.
The shortest examples I've ever seen are about 3 years from PhD to book. And the book that was written ended up very similar to that author's PhD. They got lucky that they had a topic that worked and the publisher liked it. When you read the book, it feels a bit like you're reading a PhD. We can talk about the difference between those things in a minute. For me, it took about 6 years from the completion of the PhD to the completion of the book. So I don't know, Laura, what would you say?
I think this comes back to some planning that you have to do at the beginning. So I think there are maybe two issues here. One is when you're thinking about why am I writing this book, time may well be an issue there. So there used to be, around the time that I graduated, which is now quite a long time ago, there was an expectation that you needed a monograph to get an academic job. But that isn't entirely true, and it wasn't entirely true then. You had to show that you were working towards a monograph to get a job. But you could quite often get jobs with the sort of idea that this was something that you were about to produce. And I think in some ways the cycles of things like ref lend themselves to, well, we don't actually need you to have a book now, but we need you to have one by this date. So that means that people need to think quite carefully about what are their priorities. It might be better to spend some time immediately after your PhD writing articles just to get some publication record down on your CV. And that was what happened to me, that actually, once I got my first academic job, one, I was very busy with teaching, and two, I didn't actually need a monograph at that point. So I sent my materials off to a press who, and then didn't follow up, just left it there. And after about 18 months, I thought, actually, I probably do need to find out what's happening with this book. and they weren't interested, and so I started the process again. But that was largely on me. So again, these things, the timescale is slow, but it is partly under your control as to how fast you push things, or how long you leave things. But yes, there is no kind of standard to it.
So we were talking, you mentioned REF there. For clarification, if anyone's not in the UK, maybe you don't know REF. REF stands for Research Excellence Framework, and it's how universities basically rate each other's research in theory anonymously and give scores, and the people who do well in it promote it on their websites, and the people who don't do well in it don't mention it really on their websites, or they pick out one thing they did really well and mention that again and again. But essentially, for an early career researcher who wants to work in the UK, a lot of us are thinking about what do we publish and when do we publish it based on ref, right? So when I wrote my book, part of me was thinking, should I just write it really slowly to get to the next ref deadline? Because I've already got this one job, but I'm more employable potentially if I am about to have a book come out. And so we were going to talk about this a little bit later on, but let's do it now. Does it matter when you publish your book? And Rachel, do you want to just say your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I was thinking about this in terms of the job market more than anything. And actually, Laura, I was really struck by your comment about that you may not, this perception that you have to have a book to get a job, and how whether that is really accurate or whether it is kind of a myth. And
Mm,
obviously, we've seen kind of changes in hiring practices, particularly over the last kind of 4 or 5 years. And that potential to produce is becoming stronger rather than that actual um, hard physical copy of the book already. But I
Mm.
think it still sits in the back of my mind that having that book will really help. And so for me, I was thinking a lot about securing the book contract at least to
Yeah.
help me on the job market. So that really pushed me to try and secure a contract as soon as possible, not necessarily to produce the book as soon as possible.
Mhm. Yes.
Although your publisher may disagree.
Yeah, sorry. If my publisher is listening, I am on track to submit when it says on my contract.
And I think that's an important point, that actually there's a real two-phase of process of writing a book: before a contract and after a contract. That the bit before a contract can, if all the pieces align, happen in a matter of months. It can be very quick. If your proposal lands on the desk of an editor who happens to have some time in their schedule to read it, and they send it to a reviewer who happens to turn it around very fast, and it is a wonderful book and everybody wants to go forward with it, you can then get to contract stage very quickly. And at that point, you get a formal timetable where the publisher lays out what the milestones are and the expectations are. And that is usually fairly reliable. And that is up to you. When are you going to be ready to submit it? And typically it's going to be about 12 months from the point when you submit it to having, a party to celebrate that here it actually is. That varies a little bit from press to press. Some are much quicker than that and some are a bit slower, but that would be a sort of rough ballpark for humanities publishing. But that bit before the contract, can take an indefinite amount of time, because if you're unlucky and your proposal lands on the desk of an editor who is swamped by other things, and again, some points in the what we think of now as the ref cycle are quieter than others, so you can
Yeah.
sort of try and game the system a bit, but there's also risks with that. And reviewers are a big bottleneck point at the moment in the system, so it can take a very, very long time to get through that.
Yeah. I also had another question we've got written down, so I'm going to ask it now. You talked about it a bit, Laura, but I wonder if all of us can have a discussion as well about whether it matters. Does it matter which publisher you use? Because I often feel like academia regards some publishers as better than others, or some presses are better than others, and so on. Just
Mm.
wondered, like, what our ideas were on that. Because what I did for mine was that I definitely kind of listened to the word on the street, as it were, and listen to what presses people like. I published with a press that likes to work with early career authors. And for many people with that press, it might be the first book that they write. So they're very used to handling the types of issues that come up, very friendly towards encouraging early career writers. And also, it just happened to be a book that published a good number of the things that I read for my own research. So for me, it was fairly obvious that was the press I was going to go with. But I wonder what you guys thought of that as well.
I think again, this is where it's really important to think about, why am I writing this book? And to talk to people around you about what the expectations are. People will be on very different career trajectories. If you have to go up to for tenure, your institution may have specific requirements that it's looking for, and those might be written down, or they might be just sort of tacit and understood that actually your committee will rate this better than that. So get advice on that. And again, depending on what the hurdles are that you will have to face for getting a permanent job, or getting the next contract, or getting over the next hurdle and the next promotion, find out what the sorts of expectations are in the institution that you're either at, or that you expect to be looking at for future employment. We're in an environment in which academic publishing is likely to change quite substantially over the next few years, and we can talk about open access and those kinds of issues if you are interested in that. But again, I think my best advice is also, who is going to be a good press for promoting your book once it's done? And that again comes back to who publishes in this kind of area. Where are you going to join a list where other people are going to find your book, rather than be a complete outlier? There's often a kind of snobbery about university presses, that's it looks good on a CV to have a university press. That hasn't been my experience, but again, it's about knowing what the expectations are of the environment that you were in, and thinking about that.
I've wrote on my notes here, talk to people.
Yeah.
That's one of the most important things you can do. And you can talk to an actual press at a conference. Perhaps they might have a stand where you talk to the people that work for that press, very politely acknowledging that they're extremely busy and may not have 10 minutes to listen to your monologue on a tiny topic that no one cares about. But also, colleagues, have you published with this press? Have you published with that press, and whatever, and say what they think?
That's what I certainly started by talking with colleagues and seeing where they'd published and what their experiences were. But on your point, Laura, about thinking of the environment that you're in and the expectations, I also factored in potential environments that I might be in, which I think everybody might want, some people might do as an ECR. And as you might tell from my accent, I am not from the UK originally, and I wanted to think about whether career prospects in North America would be an option for me. So actually using a university press, because it's slightly more recognizable, was something that I thought about to an audience that aren't used to maybe UK presses that aren't university ones. But I don't know about the two of you. I really looked at series over presses. For me, it was about what work is being produced in series and where does my monograph fit in with the type of research that I'm doing and the style of monograph that I would like. But also the third factor I had, which you touched on, Laura, and we might want to talk about now, is open access. So I
Let's
ended
talk
up
about open access. What is open access? If no one's heard of it, and then why does it matter?
So when I published my first monograph, open access didn't exist. That's how old I am. But open access is the idea that you can make your work available for free on the internet. And we're at an interesting transition moment. I think most of us, when we're thinking about writing a book, are still thinking about a physical copy that we can take with us wherever we go in our bag and read, in the form of print on pages, on paper pages. But actually, most of us also now access a lot of our research material electronically and digitally. And most presses will produce an electronic version and a small print run to meet varied audiences. And with the electronic version, a lot of them are behind paywalls, but there is also the potential to make it available, to a vast audience of anybody who has internet access, by putting it out there. And this has caused all kinds of issues around, well, who's paying for this and how's it going to be funded? But particularly for research that is taxpayer funded, whether that's European money or UK money or American money, there is quite reasonably the idea that if the average citizen has paid for this research through their taxes, they should be able to access the results without having to pay for that in this new world. This causes, however, lots of different challenges around, well, the publisher still needs to pay its staff and its electricity bills and keep the lights on. So we now have different levels of open access. And I can't even remember what they all are, but it comes down to sort of gold level open access is the finished product as you would get it on a printed book made available on the internet for free. A green type of open access is often where people have got the proofs or a preprint copy that might be slightly different to the original, but substantially is the same, which typically is made available through a university's own repository. So it's not put out on the publisher's website for everybody to find easily. It's a little bit more difficult to access, but it's there if you know where to go and look. And those are things to think about and talk to a publisher about. If you're an early career person and you don't have funding behind you, these are discussions to have with your employer, but also with the publisher. It may simply not be affordable to make your work freely available. Alternatively, if you have funding, you may have to make your work available as a condition of the funding.
Is that what's happening with you, Rachel?
So the series that I've gone with, they pay for the open access fees.
Oh, cool.
Which is why a part of the reason why I was drawn to this series. I also thought about maybe that might make me attractive to employers in the UK because they will have an open access monograph that they can submit to REF that they haven't paid any money for. So that's quite nice.
Very
But
clever.
so that definitely was a factor, thinking about open access and the requirement changes and REF all tied into where I'm publishing my monograph.
Right. Okay. That's all really useful things. I think we'll move on to talk about different topics now, but the whole like ABC of how you publish things is really, really helpful to people who've never done it before. I wish someone had given me that kind of information when I was just starting out, because even if you think you know everything, there are one or two things. Like I didn't know there was such thing as gold and green open access, and I've just learned something. So thanks, Laura. Maybe I should have known.
There are others as well.
Hey, I don't want to know the other colours. Like, who wants brown open access or something
I think
like
there's a
that?
platinum one now, which I
Oh,
need to probably find out what
amazing.
that is. Yeah.
Someone flies it to you on the wings of a dove. Who
Yeah.
knows? So now we're going to move on to actually writing a book. So this section is maybe useful for people who have started to write monographs and are maybe struggling on, or like want some advice on how to turn what they've got from their PhD career into something more resembling a book. So first point we're going to talk about is how to turn a PhD into a book. And I wanted to actually start by saying sometimes a PhD doesn't turn into a book, and that's a really important thing to say. So my whole PhD wasn't a book. It touched on various different topics, but not in quite enough detail to make it a monograph level detail. I had so 3 case studies that I looked at in my PhD that I individually published in different places. So one of those case studies turned into the basis for what I wrote for an edited collection, and it's one of the best things I've ever published. I'm still really pleased with it. Another case study is going to turn into another edited collection, which I'm trying to finish at the moment, and I hate, and I wish would just leave my life, and I just need it done. Thanks, collaborators. And the other case study, I basically expanded to turn into what became my monograph. So I had a chapter of a PhD that was maybe 20, 25,000 words long, and I did a whole load of other new research to deepen and kind of broaden the understandings of different areas, and that was what turned into my first monograph. Partly it was because the PhD didn't really fit very well, but also partly it was because I knew I was going to be in a certain university location, which had access to the documents that I needed to do that research, the library resources that I needed to do that extra research. So I knew that picking that particular case study worked the best for my monograph that I wanted to write. And so that was basically how I made that decision. But yeah, like what else do we think about how do you turn your PhD into a book? What do we think?
I would note that this is also culturally specific. So there are some European countries where actually publishing your PhD
Yeah,
is a
good point. Yeah,
requirement of
yeah.
the qualification, and there are presses that exist, I mean, to publish in tiny, tiny numbers the PhD more or less as it is
Mm,
written. But in the English-speaking world, and certainly now, that's absolutely not the expectation. And I think most people would say that actually it's extremely rare for a PhD to become a published book
mm.
without major revisions. And that's if you even if you passed with no corrections. And that comes back to the question of audience that I raised a bit earlier. But it is also just about yeah, scope and reflecting on the work that you've done and taking it to a new stage. Um, I've
I
lost track
thought
of the question that you
that's all
asked.
right. That how do you turn it into a book? Can I just want to
Yeah,
jump
how do you
in?
do that? Mm.
Like one thing that's really helpful in this process is if you're lucky enough to have a PhD examination that goes quite well, one of the things you might talk about is what possible publication venues are there for this work.
Mm.
And you can ask the question of your examiners, does this work as a book? Or to turn this into a book, what might we do to add to it? Or is it better as a series of articles? And I think because Laura, you mentioned that the people who actually read your PhD thesis are your supervisor and your two examiners and maybe your spouse or your cat or whatever. Um, they're the people who know your work better than anybody else. And in theory, they're also the people that know your research field as well as anybody else. So speaking to your examiners is a really, really good way around it. Obviously, your supervisor as well, if you're on good terms.
If I can add to that, or what at least talk about my experience, is that I found it really helpful to take some time away from the PhD to
Yeah.
think about A, whether it should be a book, but then how it might be a book, because my intellectual interests had changed since I started the PhD thesis, how I understood the state of our field and what I wanted to achieve, what type of scholar I wanted to be, all developed and changed in that period of time in which I was actually writing the PhD. And so it really, I would say, wasn't necessarily a reflection
Mm.
of where I was at the end of the PhD. The finished product was not quite the same. So taking time to really think about that and allow myself the opportunity to
Mm.
determine what I wanted to produce was really helpful. And the book that I am writing now is very different because I had the luxury in which I could take a year away from the PhD.
So in that period, did you write anything else, or do you just not write for a whole year? Because you've earlier said there's pressure on ECRs to publish stuff, get your career going. Like for me, that period came when I worked on that edited collection that came out of one part of my PhD, because I gave almost all my intellectual energy for a year onto that edited collection, in which I'd written a couple of chapters, but it was different kind of thinking as well to edit other people's work and to put a collection together and to do an introduction. How do you write an introduction to a collection? All kind of new energy that I was spending in new
Mm.
areas. So did
Mm.
you do something similar? Like, no, not did you publish an edited volume, but like what did you do with your writing time? Did you do anything?
Well, as I've talked about before in the podcast and previous episodes, I actually left academia for a
Yeah,
year
yeah,
right after I
that's right.
finished. And so I didn't produce anything in that year. I think
Ah,
I did one
luxury.
conference. And so I had a conference paper that is actually just now, as of yesterday, the
Yes,
like
you had
was
an article yesterday. Round of applause for Rachel.
yeah.
Had a new article come out. I did say I was going to mention it. Just drop that casually in there. Well done, Rachel. Thank you very much.
Well, it was just an idea. It was the only kind of academic idea that I had while I wasn't in academia, and it just started like a little seed then, and then many years later, it's now out in the wild
That's cool.
as a tree. But yeah, so I didn't do anything, and I think my brain really appreciated that. But I
Mm,
realized again, like I was in slightly a privileged position because I left academia for a year, and obviously I've come back, but not everyone may be able to take that time away.
yeah. And one thing I also want to mention, because I've heard my publisher, my first publisher, who did my monograph, I've heard them mention this so many times. So if I don't mention it, I feel like I'm cheating. But they recommended a book called From PhD to Book by William Germano. And I've heard my publisher recommend this book so many times to so many ECRs. So From PhD to Book by William Germano, it basically tackles that question. And it was published quite a few years ago now. Um, there are other places you can go for help like that. So publishers will have advice on their websites for that sort of thing, but also conversations with editors at publishers. I think when I was in this position, I felt like a bit of nerves approaching publishers because I
Mm,
thought like they're really busy. We know how busy they are. Why the hell do they want to talk to me? But I think it's worth reminding people that part of the job of a publisher is to find new authors and to commission new pieces and to find the next great scholar in that field. And that might be you. So they are keen to spend time talking to new authors,
mm,
scoping new ideas. And I think if you go to conferences, for example, where there are more than one publishing stand and you want to meet those publishers in the times when you're not giving papers or listening to papers, that's one of the best things you can do is just talk to numerous different publishers. And now when I go to my big annual conference every summer in the UK, I typically talk to 3 or 4 publishers who've just written to me and said, "You're at this conference. Have you got any ideas? Let's chat." And even if I haven't got any publication ideas, I still talk to them about what I'm working on and what might be useful for an avenue of something to produce in future, because you're putting names to faces and you're making contact with those publishers. They know who you are, and it's just much, much swifter if you then do have something that you want to pitch to them in the future because you've already chatted to them, you built a relationship with them, and it should work pretty well, I'd say.
mm.
Hmm.
Going back a little bit, I think your point about not everything needing to be a book is a really good one. But we can also nuance that and say, again, there are different kinds of books. I mean, a PhD should be original new research that should be publishable. Now, that may not be in a book form. It may be that your PhD was a series of case studies that actually lend themselves much better to being articles, because although you started out in the hope that they were all going to link together beautifully and give you a big outcome, you actually discovered that there were 7 very different things happening in your field. And so what you've really got is seven very different articles, and that can be great. And again, depending on your field, that may be more appropriate and more interesting to employers and funders and whoever's going to take you to the next step. But you can also, in the exciting world of the 2020s, think about the length of book that you want to do, because one of the things that I think is quite exciting in recent publishing is the rise of the mini graph, which lots of publishers now offer, which rather than being a sort of standard 100,000 words is more like 30,000 words.
Hmm.
So, you know, roughly a third of a PhD. So it's a very long article. It's a chance to take a big chunk of research that you've done and explore it in some depth without being as big a project as the 100,000 words. And it means that you can put that down on your CV as a perfectly legitimate single authored book. Employers are not going to be fooled. I've seen quite a lot of CVs recently while doing job hires where people present this very proudly. And there is a temptation to sort of pass this off as well. Look, this is my book. Employers are not going to be fooled that it's the same thing as a full length, as what we think of as a full length study, but it nonetheless shows that you can complete a substantial piece of research.
Yeah.
And it's a good foundation then for being able to say, okay, that's what I've got out of my PhD. And maybe that and some articles, and that's a springboard into whatever I'm going to do next. So there are no hard and fast rules, but it's worth thinking about what's right for you and what's right for your trajectory and making these decisions. And we can't control the future, and we're always making these decisions in a less than ideal environment where we're trying to juggle. Okay, there's never enough money to go around and never enough jobs.
That's
But
what this whole podcast is about. So
yeah,
yes.
tough,
Can
tough,
I
tough.
can I be cheeky and ask a question that's actually not really about ECRs publishing their first monograph, but a follow-up from that, Laura? Do you, in your experience, have you seen people writing the what do you call it, mini
Really
monograph?
great. Yeah.
Minigraph.
Mini graph as a springboard to, or rather, an avenue to test ideas before applying for major grants?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because one of the building blocks for getting major grants is often being able to show I have written either an article or a smaller book as a way of proving the concept. So I can say, I want to do this frontier research. I want to go where no researcher has gone before and test this out. Please give me a lot of money, but so that you feel confident that this is not going to be a catastrophic failure, here's what I've done so far, and like, I can show on a small scale that I think this is going to work. So now please give me money and to do a big project. I think that can be a really compelling case for a funder. An article might do that just as well. Again, it's about thinking about where you publish things. But my sense recently is that journals increasingly are asking for 8 to 10,000 words. So journal articles are sort of getting smaller in some ways than they used to be, which leaves us with a bit of a gap. But I think the mini graph is partly filling that space of where people used to sometimes publish very long articles. And some places will take very long articles, but it all comes down to what am I trying to achieve and what is the right format for what I'm trying to say.
Thank you. I'm going to store that piece of information away.
Yeah, me too. I love how we never tell anyone what to do on this podcast, but we always say, here's even more options than you knew existed. You pick one. And these are our experiences of those options.
Academia really is like choose your own adventure.
Yeah, yeah. And deal with the consequences. So let's talk about actually writing it. So this is one of the biggest questions that I think ECRs can often discuss on this topic, which is how do you actually get it done when you've got other things like teaching or research, or maybe other employment, like Rachel, you were just telling us about how you published your article while you weren't working in academia. We just wanted to talk for a while about some tips on how to actually get it done, because it's all very well having a contract, but then how do you turn that into a book? We talked on one of our earlier podcasts about writing rituals, improving your writing habits. So you can go back and listen to that episode if you want tips on, being a more productive writer, I guess. But we'll also cover that in this section, I think, on today's discussion. Wonder if Rachel, you'd like to start by outlining, like, could you tell us like where you are on this and what your experiences are of it? And I'll jump in as well. So, feel free to share as much or as little as you like.
Okay, sure. So as I mentioned, I am in the middle of writing my monograph. I am writing the final chapter, and I'm about
Oh,
halfway through. Very much feel like I'm in the weeds. It's yeah, it's a bit overwhelming, which I think most people when they're writing their first monograph can feel. For context, I am employed on another research project full time. My employer has been exceptionally generous, and I'm allowed to work on my monograph 1 day a week.
Oh, okay.
And I'm very grateful to my PI for that. And also, it works really well for my writing style. And we can talk a bit more about how people approach it. But I really like to have a full day where I can dive into it and not think about all the other research that I'm doing at the moment, because I have articles that I'm trying to finish, and then also my new research project, which has many strands to it, and I'm learning a lot of new skills as well as scholarship in that project. And then I have my book. So having 1 day to block off everything else and write has been helpful for me, although I do feel sometimes the motivation drops. I have to take like an hour to be like, right, okay, what did I do last week? How do I get
Yeah.
back into it? Yeah, I don't know how you guys
So
juggled.
I was, that leads on to what I wanted to say about this actually, I think, because my approach was almost the opposite to yours. I've talked about this before, I think, on an earlier episode. But for me, getting stuff written is about rhythm and regular small bits of progress. I wrote my monograph basically most days by coming into work around 8 and then spending 2 hours between about 8 and 10 every weekday doing book work, whether that's reading something new or writing or looking at some resources online for my documents that I'm looking at. But 2 hours every day, I felt like I didn't have long spells where I'd forgotten where I was and what I was writing, and I had my motivation chipping away at my motivation all the time. And do you remember when we talked about writing rituals? Anna mentioned that you want to park facing downhill, meaning that you want to leave yourself in a really good place where you know what you're going to do next. And that really helped me do that, because I often didn't get done everything I wanted to get done in those 2 hours, but it meant that I had the enthusiasm and the motivation to go back to it the next day. And obviously, timetables and whatever can get in the way of this. If you find that you write better in the evening, then you can just block out that time in the evenings. Or if you're someone who writes really well in the middle of the day, for example, you could do that. But for me, it was about small bits of regular progress all the time. And eventually we got there. But, it took a while. It took a
Mm.
while. Um, but the challenges, I mean, like, what's the point of asking this question? Like, the challenges are that you've got teaching, you've got research, you've got other things chipping away at your motivation, you've got deadlines that are immediately pressing, whereas the book deadline is always the one that's the least immediately pressing, isn't it? So I don't know. Laura, give us your pearls of wisdom on this.
Well, I think a lot of what you've said is really good and really helpful. It is a marathon and not a sprint, writing a book. And depending on how much you are changing an existing set of research. So if we're assuming that most people's book comes out of their PhD in some shape or form, a lot of what you're doing when you're writing is actually revising and editing and revisiting rather than necessarily doing new research from scratch. And that can be a continuation of the final stages of a PhD, but it can also be a new process of coming back to something critically. But I think for me, yes, I was trying to do my book at a point where I had a lot of other things going on, but like you, trying to make a regular slot, trying to work on it every day, trying to prioritize the bit of the day when my brain was likely to be functioning best, and absolutely trying to leave it always at a positive point from knowing where I was going to pick it up. Those were all really, really helpful things. And just being kind to yourself about
Yeah.
process, to which I'm going to add a caveat to at the end, but just remembering it's a big thing. It is a hard thing, and you're going to have days when it doesn't go well, and that's okay. You will have better days as well.
Yep.
but you've also got to have grit. You've got, and I see this in other people as well. You've got to. This is where making good decisions at the start of the process is important, because you've got to really want to do this. It is a hard slog, and you have to keep going. And in the same way that ultimately the only way to write a PhD is to make yourself sit down and write a PhD and stop worrying too much about everything else and whether you're comfortable and whether this is optimal. And I think you're gesturing at a really important point, which is that for a lot of people, when you're doing your PhD, you have a lot of dedicated time for that. And I know you may be working or doing other things around it, but by and large, you're actually in a very luxurious situation, which gives you the potential to worry too much about the process. Whereas when you've got a lot of other things to deliver, you just have to get on with it. And I think there is an element of you just have to get on with it.
When we did our earlier episode on academia and parenting, in
Mm,
fact, one of our contributors, Laura, said, um, actually, when I had children, I was really productive because I had no choice.
yeah,
And I think
absolutely.
kind of having a busy teaching load, or your other research project like yours, Rachel, on that day, Rachel, you must feel like you've got no choice. This is your day. This is your time. And I was thinking, do Rachel and I do different things? And actually, we do the same thing, but we just spread it out in different ways. So you do 1 day a week, writing regularly and making regular progress, whereas my regular process is smaller, but it comes more often. So we're basically doing the same thing. It's about rhythm and pattern. And I bet you have the same thing that you do. You probably walk your dog that morning, you make a cup of tea and you sit down and you make yourself ready and you go. And that's exactly what I do. You just, whatever your rituals and your patterns are, like we talked about in our earlier episode, you've got to be kind of tapping into them, I think, and aware of what are the best conditions for you.
Yeah, for sure. I think any writing process, you learn a lot about yourself as well and what works for you. And a monograph is no different in that way, except
Yeah.
as Laura said, it's a marathon. So you have even more time to discover
Yeah.
what's going to work for you at particular phases in your life too,
Yeah.
because your circumstances will change so much in that period,
Yeah, that's true.
especially if it's like 6 years, 7 years, life changes.
Yeah.
Mm.
The other thing you can try, which is worth mentioning, I did a bit of this last year, is a writing group, whether an online one or an online kind of um, digital block out. What's it called? Uh, Come on, I'm making myself sound really old now. What do people call it on Twitter when they have like a we're going to meet again in an hour and talk about our
Writing
progress?
retreat.
Yeah, writing retreat, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, or you can do them in person with people that you might work with. I've tried these in the last year or so and found them to be really, really helpful as a way to motivate yourself because there's peer pressure from the other people, but
Mm.
also as a support network. Because if you have a really bad hour where nothing goes right, and somebody else says, yeah, me too, and you start chatting, it's so invaluable to get that from other people. So if you hear of a writing group, or if you want to find one, Twitter is a really good place to find writing groups that people might set up, and everyone will tweet their progress after an hour or whatever, and then go back and write for another hour. They're really good. And if you haven't got one at your institution, set one up and see what happens. We just do ours via Zoom, like this podcast, and we just turn our cameras off for an hour, and you can hear people tapping away for an hour, and they might be doing anything like the cat meme, just like whatever. But actually, I managed to write my book proposal and my sample chapters last year for my next book purely in those writing groups,
Mm.
and it was a really economical way of doing it. Um, Here's a question. I'm going to ask Rachel because she's written an answer on our notes. Who do you go to for help? So if you're struggling either to work out what to write, or if a section is that you've written is any good and you want help, like is it that you're on your own and you're working this, and it's not, is it? So like what types of people do we go to for help when we're writing books? It's a really good question because everyone's answer is different probably.
Yeah. I mean, so I, much like you, Charlie, my my monograph is very different to my PhD. I have 2 chapters are completely new research, new topics, kind of new topics entirely to me, and so I don't feel as I guess sure as myself. I have so many questions, and I can't always work out the problems because it's not a case of revising and revisiting whether I still agree with what I said at my PhD. So I rely on my mentors a lot, including one of my PhD examiners, to kind of test out ideas and informal conversations. And I've already scoped out a few people who are willing to read a draft of my monograph before I send it to the publishers. So that's who I turn to, and friends, but it's a lot to ask your friends to test it out. What about you guys?
Yeah,
What did you do?
yeah, Laura, what would you do?
Well, like Rachel, I think it's really important to me to have things read by other people and people that I trust, people who aren't going to be absolutely devastating, but who are still going to be able to show me where something isn't working. Because the hardest thing when you've spent hours and hours deep in the topic is knowing whether your ideas are coming across clearly to somebody who is reading it from scratch. I like collaborative working. I like working in teams. So then you start to have a lot of people around who have a degree of similar expertise and will be interested. And I read other people's work and they read mine. But it's about finding the people you trust who will give you helpful feedback. And that is a scary process at the beginning. But I think it's really worth doing because I get a lot out of it. It really enriches what I do.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, is to pick people that you trust. So
Mm,
I have a couple of people like this. Um, and I have like a kind of group of who I'd regard as like kind of my peers, really, who I might go to first,
mm,
because I don't mind criticism. Like, I'm sort of less afraid to show my work to them first than I am to maybe people who you might regard as like higher up the academic ladder than
mm,
me and my peers and that kind of thing. So yeah, I would do the same thing, and you don't have to send them the whole book. Like, I've done this with journal articles or even conference papers and so on. So important to build up your own informal support network. I actually got asked this question in a job interview once. How do you guarantee what you write is good?
Oh, that's an
So I
interesting
said,
question.
yeah, I know, right? So the answer was basically I send it to other people and get them to give me feedback. And
mm.
they said that was the best answer they had on the day. And I thought, what other answers are there? I don't know. Put it on Twitter and see what people think. I don't know. But I think that just underlines how important that is, to
Mm,
find other people. And if you can't find other people, then go on social media and ask for help and say, does anyone want to read my stuff? And be careful who replies and so on. But can we build up a community of people to share our work with each other and things like that? It's so important. So in your institution or online groups, whatever, um,
mm.
that's really important, I think. Oh wow, who wrote this question?
I did, and it kind of leads on from our discussion.
Ask it.
Okay, so my question to both of you, because this is something I'm struggling with at the moment, is how do you maintain confidence in the importance of your monograph? Because it is a marathon and you can't maintain that enthusiasm all the way. But also, writing your first monograph, at least in my experience, it's more isolating than a PhD because you don't have a PhD supervisor, and you're not necessarily surrounded by fellow PhD students who are also writing their thesis and getting really enthusiastic about ideas. And colleagues and peers in departments are amazing, but it is different. Um, so yeah, how do you make sure you maintain confidence in your work as you go?
Over
It
to
is,
you.
yeah, it is difficult. And while I agree that sometimes colleagues are amazing, there is a real difference between being part of a PhD cohort where you can all moan together about how awful writing a PhD is, and how nobody understands your struggle, and then being in a department where some colleagues are supportive but also you're dealing with a lot of pressures around, well, who gets sabbatical leave and how much time do you get to write your monograph, and is everybody pulling their weight, and what are the priorities? And you will have colleagues who feel that they're not getting enough time to do their research, and who may be jealous of your progress, and there is often a sense of pressure around competition for jobs, and then competition for promotions and things like that. So yes, it can feel like a very isolating experience for lots of reasons, and you do have to be committed to it. I'm not sure that I have a good answer. It may be comforting to know that I think in every really big book project that I've done, there has been a point where I thought, I'm never doing this again. That you hit a moment of despair, and then somehow the momentum of it just keeps you going, because you've come so far. You might as well finish it off. I do think Charlie's previous point about the importance of a network of peers, the people who really believe in your research, who are actually relatively unlikely to be in your immediate department, because if somebody else was working in your field, they're unlikely to be, unless you're in a research team and project, then actually a department is unlikely to have hired two of you that are doing the same thing. So having those wider networks, getting opportunities to go to conferences and talking about it, that's often where people get excited, and you see, oh yeah, this is new. And you remember that although you know this stuff backwards and are bored with it now, actually it's exciting to other people. That can be very good for energy levels. And again, just having moments where you're kind to yourself, and you recognize that, yeah, this is a slog, but it's part of what we do, and we just get on with it. And we just keep going. I remember at one point, and I'm sure other people have talked about this probably on previous podcasts, giving myself a target of, I am going to write 500 words every day this week. They don't have to be good words, they just have to be words. And then it builds, and you get to the end of the week and you've written probably more actually than your target once you get going. And then the next week you've got a lot of words, and then you can start to go back and revise those words, and it keeps going, and it has its own momentum. But just things where you can see your milestones and your progress can help.
The other thing I wanted to mention is a kind of a delicate thing, because for some people it can be a really negative influence. But mine is also like, the thing that motivated me most to write my book was looking at what my peers were doing and thinking, I'm better than that. I'm going to finish this, or I'm better than you. Or like, I'm looking at what you're doing, you're ahead of me, that's unfair, I'm going to catch up, kind of thing. And that's a really negative influence on us sometimes. And we have to be really careful with it. But competition can also be healthy. So do with that what you will. I definitely do not think it's healthy to look at everybody else's achievements and judge yourself negatively, because that's part of the reason why we have this podcast, right? And I think all of us listening recognize that's a very negative thing to do. But one of my motivations was looking at other people and knowing, if they can do it, I can do it, or if they can do it, I can do it better. And then, our readers can be the judge of that kind of thing if they want to. But it got me over the line. The other thing is also, Laura touched on it, but it's really, really important because I want to mention it as well, is having mentors that believe in you and give you that belief can be so, so, so valuable and important. And there are people that work in my field who've never formally worked with me before in any kind of situation, but I know them from conferences, and I know them from just chatting in general, maybe even online. I've met them chatting. That really is invaluable. If you can find that, then that's one reason why going to conferences is a good idea, and meeting new people. Don't call it networking, call it making friends at work. And it's so, so important, because those are the people that give you belief. When you feel like you want to cry and you don't want to write anymore, you can go to them and they will help you. And immediately they'll just look after you. And then eventually they'll say, well, look, how about we do this? How about we try that? And all of us get that now, whatever career stage we're at, whether we're early career researchers or if you're like Laura, you're a mid-career researcher, we've all got support networks. Even late career researchers will have the same thing. So I guess that would be our answers to that question. It's a good question, though. Thanks for asking it. It's a really important one.
It's good to
Um,
hear your
I've
responses.
got one last question which I want us to talk about really quickly, but people will want to ask it, and that is academic or trade, right? So sometimes people write books with academic presses in an academic format for academic sellers. Sometimes people turn their research into what we might call trade books, selling in bookshops, selling them to your relatives who are looking for a book at Christmas and that kind of thing. Academic or trade? Go. I mean, what do we think?
Well, it comes back to the point that we've been hovering around repeatedly, which is what do you want to get out of the process and where are you going? Because there
Yeah.
are real big consequences to that decision.
Yeah.
And so talk to mentors, understand what is needed for the next career stage that you want. If you want an academic job, you need to write an academic book.
Yeah.
Is
That's really
kind of
important to say, isn't it?
crucial.
Yeah.
Books are I on one level all books look like books, but academic peers will be expecting certain standards and levels of peer review, and there is a risk that trade books, rightly or wrongly, are not taken as seriously as evidence of your intellectual potential and academic abilities. In some ways, that's very, very unfair. It's just as hard, if not harder, to write a trade book, but there are real consequences to that. Also, be realistic. If you want to write a trade book for money, trade books make academic books will not make you money. I make probably in the region of about £250 a year from all royalties on everything that I've written, and I've been going for a while. So academic books are not going to enable you to take early retirement, much to my dismay. A trade book that is successful will make you a substantial amount of money. It would have to be very successful to make you enough to live on.
Yeah.
And remember that you would have to turn out trade books at very regular intervals to be able to earn enough to replace a salary. So you need to think carefully about, if you want to make revenue from books, what do you need? How's that going to impact your lifestyle? Where are you going to live? Particularly through the early stages of building up a portfolio of material that's going to bring in money. So again, these will have consequences for the trajectory of your career and what you do next. You might get lucky and your book might get picked up and turned into a Netflix series or an award-winning film that is going to bring you a lot of money, but those cases are rare.
Yeah,
So
happened to a colleague of
just be
mine
realistic about
recently.
that. Yeah,
Happened to
sorry.
a colleague of mine recently. And although she's gained tons and tons of publicity from it, the actual financial benefit is not that high. She ended up being a consultant on the film of the book that she actually wrote. So, they can write any story they want with the material that you give them. So whatever. So yeah, I think that's a really good answer to that question. I don't think really we need to talk about that anymore because Laura has said such useful things. So I think we're pretty much ready to draw this episode to a close. How to write your first monograph. Does anyone have any questions that they want to say or anything you want to finish on? Anything you're burning to tell everyone?
The only thing I think I would say is that we've been quite negative about the struggles.
We tend to be positive on this podcast.
I know, and I think we should be. I think we should try and end on a positive note. It is a real privilege in the world in which we currently live, to be able to dedicate our times and energy to subjects that we really believe in and care about, and to expanding our horizons. One of the things that enables me to write is actually being very, very selfish. I never imagine anybody else reading the book. I write purely in the first instance for as part of my understanding and to help me process ideas. And then in editing, I kind of try and make sure that it's accessible to other people. And it is, therefore, when it goes well, it's absolutely joyful. And there's a real sense of achievement to having done that. And the hard copies go into libraries where they will be around for potentially hundreds of years, long after I'm around. And that's a sobering
I love that.
thought. But it
That,
is a
yeah.
good thing to have the opportunity to do that. And a lot of the process can be really fun as well. For all the moments of dismay and horror, like actually there's a lot of joy to be had along the way.
It's my favorite part of the job. It really is. Like, it's when I'm at my most creative and my most engaged, when I've got my kind of mental flow and I'm writing well and enjoying it, is my favorite thing that we do. And just like you said, Laura, about hard copies that hang around for ages. I wrote a book about a load of old books that were written maybe 1,000 years ago, and in a certain cathedral in the north of England. And I was bound to give them a hard copy of my book because they gave me some images to put in the book. So now my book is in that cathedral with the books that were written 1,000 years ago that were featured in the book, and the authors who I talk about in my book, their ghosts probably read my book every day and go, no, he got it all wrong, but they can't talk to me about it. And that's amazing. I love that. And the physical effects of it. Just a bit of personal information. Laura and I had an actual book launch in the end, because I had a book that came out during COVID and we never had a book launch. And you had a collection of essays, didn't you? Is that what you put in that?
Yes, there were two collections of essays.
Yeah,
There were three things that came out in the same series during COVID, all of which were frustrated, and because we weren't allowed to see each other. So I did feel that we'd missed the opportunity to celebrate, and also because there were two edited collections, there were lots of people involved, and it was just an
great.
opportunity to get people together and say, look what we've
And
achieved.
we had cakes made in with the covers of the books on the front of the cakes, and they are the most incredible cakes. Like, just write your book because you want a cake, right? If you don't need any more motivation, you want a book cake, right? And that was great, and it was really fun, and it gave us a chance to thank people in public and everything. So yeah, really good to finish on a positive. Thank you so much. So thank you everyone for your thoughts. I thought it was really useful. If you have questions you'd like to ask us based on the things that we've spoken about today, then you can get in touch by contacting us on Twitter, where we are known as ECR Podcasters, and on Blue Sky, where we're also known as ECR Podcasters, or you can email ecrpodcasters@gmail.com for any feedback or questions that you might have based on that process. If there's anything specific to any of the contributors, then we'll pass them on and try and get you your answers on that. We'll be back with another episode soon. So thank you for listening to our fantastic episode 9 on how to write your first monograph. It's just left for me to thank Rachael. Thank you very much, Rachael.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you. And Laura. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you. And thank you from me. I'm Charlie. Hope you enjoyed listening. Speak to you again